Okay, I'm really glad to be here. The novel that I will be reading a selection from is E.L. Doctorow's The Book of Daniel. And it is, first of all, he's one of our greatest writers. He just passed away this last year, and we have seen the passing of a real giant with E.L. Doctorow gone. But he's most famous, of course, for Ragtime, which was made into a marvelous hit movie, but this book also was made into a movie. It's based loosely, but imaginatively and very creatively on the Rosenberg case of 1950-51. They were executed in 1953. And he's made some rather ingenious changes. When they were arrested in 1950 and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, they had two sons, Michael and Robert. And at the time, in 1950, Michael was 7 and Robert was 3 or 4. And this novel gives the Rosenbergs, first of all, they're the Isaacsons in the novel, not two sons, but a son and a daughter. And so the passage I'm going to select is going to reveal why that was particularly imaginative of Doctorow. Michael and there's really two novels in one. It's a novel about the 1950s, the McCarthy era, and the Rosenberg case. But the narrator is Daniel. In the book, the son is Daniel, the daughter is Susan, and the narrator is Daniel at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s. And during that time, both Daniel and Susan have become very active in the anti-war movement, and in the novel they are as well. And so it's not only a novel about the 50s, but it's a novel about the 60s and the mayhem of the 1960s. So this passage has to do with the period immediately after the Rosenbergs were imprisoned and before their trial, when both of them ended up in an orphan children's shelter in the Bronx. And that was so because for a brief period of time they were with grandmother Greenglass, and that's dramatic because David Greenglass was, of course, Ethel's brother, and he was one of the chief witnesses against her. He later confessed publicly that he lied on the stand because the prosecutors wanted him to perjure himself because they wanted to get Ethel Rosenberg convicted, hoping that the threat of a death penalty for her would force her or both of them to spill the beans on higher ups. And of course, that did not happen. So we now know that Julius Rosenberg was clearly guilty. It's not clear how serious a thing he had done. He was victimized most by time. Had he been discovered in 1944, 1945, he would have been fired and not much would have been done about it. The Soviet Union was our most important ally because they were fighting the entire Eastern Front War. In any case, we'll start then as the children get put into the orphanage. And it's Daniel narrating. Each boy had an army bunk with khaki blankets, which he was expected to make every morning. He had a cubby next to the bed and a foot locker at the foot of the bed. Your laundry bag was supposed to be tied to the foot of the bed, and you were not supposed to paste anything on any of the walls. The walls were a kind of brown tile. The floor was vinyl tile, also brown. The windows were tinted safety windows. embedded with diamond cross-hatching like filamented chain-link fence. All the surfaces were hard, and the din was unbelievable. To quiet us down, he blew a whistle, which left points of pain in my ear. He blew a whistle to wake you up in the morning. There were always 30 to 40 boys in the room, ages 5 to 12. They tried to assign little guys to big guys, the sort of big brother system, but it didn't work out very well. Some of the kids there were obviously sick. It was commonly thought that they were retarded, but I know now that at least a couple of them were autistic. One kid never got off of his bed of his own free will. If he was stood up near his bed, he stood there until he was moved. They called him the inertia kid. Someone always had to arrange the inertia kid in a position that he was supposed to be in at that moment. Another boy, a swarthy little hysteric, did not speak in recognizable sentences or with emotions that had anything to do with what was going on. He had a habit of walking around the edges of the gym whenever we went there to play, or the outdoor yard. This kid would run around the circumference of wherever enclosure we were in, and after the first few times, you kind of didn't even notice him. He was always chattering to himself, walking around the edges of the places. All the oddballs were put down at the end of the room. At the other end, near the doors, were the transient beds. Boys who came to the shelter for only a few days or a week or two, they steered near those doors. So the sense you had of the community was a hardcore of permanent residents in the middle with eroded borders of nuts and temporaries. After the first month, I was moved from the temporary status to the hardcore. Now, we were on the third floor of the shelter. The girls' section was on the second floor. Sometimes, at night, I lay after lights out, and in the dark quiet, I heard the screams of rage of my sister coming up through the walls. Once a week, we had fire drill. Once a week, we had bomb drill. For the fire drill, you went out and out on the sidewalk, and for the bomb drill, you stayed in. The first floor was for the offices of the staff, the lunchroom, and the kitchen. The fourth and top floor was completely taken up with the indoor gym. The name of the place was the East Bronx Children's Welfare Shelter. City of New York, Honorable William O'Dwyer, Mayor, Honorable Edward J. Flynn, Bronx Borough President. It's located off Tremont Avenue near Crotona Park in a cluster of municipal buildings. A bus took the hardcores to school every day. I don't know why we were taken to one public school rather than another. There was one within walking distance to which we didn't go. The big purple school we did go to was as far away, and although in a different direction, as to what I thought of as my real purple school, PS 70. That was the school that the boys went to, that he and his sister went to before everything blew up. It made a little impression on me. I don't even remember the name of it today, or the number. Nobody cared whether you did the work or not. It was an old school with tired, grim teachers and a lot of black kids. At the shelter, the big game was softball. The quality of athletics was very high. Kids played intensely, and they played well. The best games were on Sunday, because in the morning we'd all sit on our beds in our best clothes and wait for relatives and guardians or whatever to take us out for the day. By noon, it was clear who was not going to be taken out. And so there would be a choose-up game in the yard, or if it was cold, up in the gym. And usually it was unsupervised. The Sunday games were played fiercely. Everybody played like hell. I learned the game on Sundays. Someone always ripped up his best pants sliding on the concrete or tore a sole off of his shoes. The girls watched and taunted, and it was completely self-contained, totally populated society with nobody of any importance missing. Most of the children wore clothes that didn't fit, socks bunched up around the ankles, flowered dresses of older sisters, pants from Goodwill that had to be folded at the waist and stuffed under the belt. In the lunchroom, they served lukewarm frankfurters from big pots of water covered with amber slick. They served vegetable soup. They served half-pint containers of milk. They served creamed corn and mashed potatoes. I'll never forget the smell of the lunchroom. It was a warm, good smell, far better than the food. I suppose it was the smell of the vegetable soup, which, since eventually it incorporated everything else, outsmelled everything else. I connect that smell with impoverishment. I think of vegetable soup as disenfranchisement. When Phyllis, that's Daniel's wife in the novel. We're in the late 60s, but he's telling the story. When Phyllis makes vegetable soup, she keeps adding things in hopes of recapturing that smell for me. She never touched it. I think you need tile walls. You need high ceilings with lights hanging down on chains. And you need cafeteria trays out of maroon-colored plastic. The other big smell in the shelter was the smell of vomit. There was always a lot of vomiting. Kids were always getting sick and throwing up. The janitor came around with his cart and his big broom and his shovel and a bucket of sawdust. And he covered up the vomit with the sawdust. And when it was all soaked up, he swept up the sloppy mess with his broom and his shovel. Then he'd mop around the solution with a solution of ammonia. And the ammonia would drown out the smell of the vomit for 5 minutes or so. But for the rest of the day, the area smelled faintly of vomit. In this fainter essence, it was mysterious and frightening, the smell of insides of bodies. Maybe it was the smell of vomit which did something for the vegetable soup. One day, Mr. Levinson told me to go downstairs to the psychologist's office. The psychologist was Mr. Guglielmi. He was younger than Mr. Levinson. He worked in the shelter part-time. He wore a jacket and tie. Mr. Levinson only wore a shirt. He wore shiny brown shoes with thick soles. He talked to each kid once a month for 10 or 15 minutes. "Come in, Dan, have a seat." The psychologist lit a cigarette, leaned back in a wooden swivel chair that squeaked. "Dan," he said, "I need your help." Daniel stared at him. "I don't know what to do about your kid's sister. We're trying to make her feel at home. We're trying to make friends with her, but she's given us a very hard time. Let me ask you, did she throw tantrums when you still lived at home?" Daniel shook his head. "Well, she doesn't eat properly. She keeps the other kids awake. If someone says something to her or even looks at her the wrong way, she starts to scream. She won't cooperate with anyone." Daniel smiled. He couldn't help it. Mr. Guglielmi said, "I'm asking you what you think we ought to do." Daniel said, "She thinks this is a jail." The psychologist wrote something down, and then he leaned forward. "But that's foolish," he said softly. "There are no bars on the windows, no locks on the doors. She can go out and play in the yard at playtime." "Well, you won't let her sleep in bed with me," Daniel said. The psychologist wrote something down, and then he said, "And that makes her think it's a jail?" "In jail, people are kept apart, and then they're killed." Daniel couldn't help smiling. "Oh, now, come on a minute. That's not what happens in jail. People do something wrong, and they have a trial. If they're found guilty, they go to jail for a certain time. But then they're released. They're not killed. Very few people do something serious enough for that." "Well, my mother and father are in jail, and they haven't had a trial." "Well, that's just a technicality. They're waiting for their trial." "Why can't they wait at home with us?" "I don't know, Dan. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe the government's afraid that they would run away." "Well, they wouldn't feel afraid if they weren't going to kill them." The psychologist shook his head and he put his cigarette out. Have you discussed this with Susan? No, it would make her cry. Would you like to sleep with her too? No, she wets the bed. The psychologist wrote something down and he said, well, what are we going to do? Supposing we gave you more time with her during the day. Would that help? Daniel shrugged. You see, we have rules here. We have a certain way of doing things, and the boys are in one section and the girls are in another section. Those are the rules. So that's like jail, Daniel said. Daniel, this is the East Bronx Children's Shelter. This is not jail. Hey, look at me when I talk to you. Did I tell you you had to come here? No. No. Did I tell Susan she had to come here? No. No. Well, then how can it be jail? Your parents asked the city if you could stay here. They asked their lawyer to put your names in the application. Are you saying that your own parents would put you in jail? Daniel shrugged. I don't know. I don't know. Would a mother and father put their own children in jail? I don't know. I don't know. Well, they wouldn't. You know they wouldn't. Daniel ran his finger along the edge of the desk. Supposing the letters he got from his mother and father were really written by the FBI, imitating their handwriting. Or suppose the FBI made them say that they wanted their children in the shelter. He didn't really believe it, but if it happened to be true, he'd better be on guard. Because if they did put him and Susan in here, why, they would have a reason, and the reason would be to make them hate their mother and father, and then maybe make up lies about them. Mr. Guglielmi had come around to the front of the desk and sat one leg down upon it. Besides, he said, if this was a jail, you wouldn't be allowed to have any fun. And you do have fun here, don't you, Daniel? Daniel shrugged. Yes. Are you making friends? Daniel shrugged. He nodded. Good. Is there anything bothering you that you'd like to talk to me about? No. Okay, I think what we'll do is let Susan eat with you, and maybe at bedtime we'll let you sit with her a few minutes until she gets sleepy. Let's try that, okay? Okay, Daniel said. If we didn't have rules, Daniel, the psychologist said, then we couldn't get our work done here. You can see that, can't you? And there are just too many of us to get by without rules. Do you want to go home? Yes. If I take you, will you be a big girl and do what I say? Yes, because we have to do it when no one will see us. And so you'll have to listen to me to do what I tell you to do, all right? All right. Okay, now that's a promise? Yes. Say, I promise, Daniel. I promise, Daniel. All right, now today's Thursday. We're going to escape Saturday. That's not today. That's not tomorrow, but the next day. I want to escape now. Susan, you just made a promise. You better listen to me, or we won't do it at all. If we escape before then, it'll be easier for them to catch us. You don't want them to catch us, do you? No. All right. All you have to do in the meantime is what they tell you. Go to sleep when they tell you and eat when they tell you. I'm not going to wait for you if you're tired, so you better not be tired. And if you eat something, you won't be hungry when we go. And once we escape, I don't know when we'll eat. So you've got to eat and all your food and go to sleep, all right? Yes. And on Saturday we'll go. Yes. And listen, you can't tell anyone. I won't. I hate them. Saturday, the discipline relaxed. Some of the kids were taken home for the weekend. There was no school. There was more free time. After breakfast, there was a free period in the yard. There were lots of kids in the yard all running around. On Saturday, no one would stop you in the street to ask why you weren't in school. It was a chilly morning. I looked up into the gray sky of swiftly moving clouds, and my heart turned over. I was wearing my mackinaw and my leather hunter's cap. Susan had on her snow jacket with a hood. I had my sneakers on, but she only had her shiny black ankle strap shoes. All right, now, sit down here at the fence. That's it. Now, when I say you lie down, and I'll lift the fence up and you roll under. All right. Then I'll crawl under and then run as fast as you can. I had this idea that if we went home to Williams was the black guy that lived in their basement, and he used to take care of their property and some of the other neighbors' properties nearby. I had this idea that if we went home to Williams, somehow that would have the effect of getting our mother and father home too. I felt as long as we were in the shelter, they'd be in jail. I felt that they would have no chance of reaching home unless we were there. And I wanted to put it all back together. My reasoning seemed logical at the time. I had no sense of faith or belief. It merely seemed logical that if Susan and I went home, it would be restored. And Paul and Rochelle might even precede us, and we'd meet them. All right, now get ready. Do you have to go to the bathroom? No. I don't know where to find any bathrooms, so you better go now if you have to. I'll wait for you. No. Alone, in the Cold War, Daniel and Susan ran down Tremont Avenue. It's a busy, curving cobblestone avenue lined with stores and delicatessens, movies and automobile showrooms, bars and Chinese restaurants. From west to east, it snakes over the hills of the Bronx, a major artery. Trolley tracks, no longer used, flow down its center. It bleats with traffic. Daniel had some knowledge. He knew that the shelter was on the East Bronx and that his home was on the West Bronx, but he didn't know which way was west. He looked for signs on the front of buses nosing past. He looked for the sun, but there wasn't any sun. They scurried along, the little girl, pulled by her brother, hurrying along the storefronts, darting past doorways, weaving through the people, walking, shopping, waiting for lights at corners. Daniel's side hurt. Each step brings him pain. He's sweating. Not so fast, his sister whines. You're going to make me fall. Every few minutes, she has to stop and pull her socks off her heels. Her white cotton socks slip down into her shoes, and she has to tug them up. Ahead on 3rd Avenue, an L crosses over Tremont Avenue, leaving a tunnel of shadow, a premonition of long distances. In this darkness of black steel beams that shimmy when the trains roar overhead, the green traffic lights shine cool and bright. A newsstand nestles under the stairs leading to the trains. The smell of hot dogs, juicy fruit gum, popcorn, the suggestion of being lost in the city. You can't ask anyone the way because nobody gets more sympathy than a child who's lost his way. People don't forget that. That's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. Worse, they take you in hand and then you're captured. So you walk in dumb panic, hoping to be right, looking for signs, prodding your intuition, walking as if you knew where you were going. Decisively, you cross the street and turn left. How much more? Are we going to be there soon? Be quiet. Is it soon? Soon, be quiet. The small warm hand in my hand. The imprint is permanent. The small warm hand in my hand, it's given to me and not withdrawn. The small warm hand in my hand. Every few steps I hear the traffic and movement of the city and a soft hiss, like a signal from a doorway, like a static from a secret radio. I'm ever on the alert for secret signals. But it's Susan, sniffling in the privacy of my ear, measuring our progress with intakes of her runny nose. A Occasionally she draws a sleeve across her face. What are you crying about? I'm not. Am I going too fast? Yes. I check to see if anyone's following. We're off the rumbling avenue and walking down a tenement street of the East Bronx. It's a poor neighborhood. Occasionally, we pass small porch houses of asphalt shingles, just like our own. No one appears to be following. I slow up, but we don't stop. Kids stare at us from their stoops and doorways. I can't pretend to be doing anything but passing through. There rises in me a feeling for the shelter. I think of the lunch hour, the Saturday noon frankfurters, nostalgia, a slight smear of homesick in the chest. Is that possible? Is it possible for feelings to be that indiscriminate? Behind us is my vision of the inertia kid lying on his bunk. I'm sorry for my routines. They were a failure. He knew I made fun of him. He knew what I was doing. I feel terrible. I feel the sickness of someone who's sold out. Occasionally, in certain lights, the idiocy of his expression was momentarily erased. His face was comely. I knew he was handsome and wise. I was afraid to look at him. I adored him. If I had stayed at the shelter, I could have taken care of him and protected him from impersonations. In the afternoon, Daniel and Susan had come to the section of Bathgate Avenue between 173rd Street and Claremont Parkway. It was an open market of fruit and vegetable stalls and peddlers, push carts at the curbs. The sidewalks were crowded with shoppers and merchants in their full-length white aprons over their coats. They cried out their prices to passers-by. Pyramids of apples and dark grapes and oranges and pumpkins rose from the stalls, prices written on brown paper bags impaled on wooden slats. 2 pounds for 19 cents, 6 for 33, fresh, sweet, juicy. Bushels of green peppers, boxes of carrots in bunches, and the green toppings are wrung off with purchase. Dates poured into the bag through a metal scoop. Indian nuts, rock candy. They stood in front of an open appetizing store, magnetized by slabs of lox. And the pickle barrels, and the nut trays, and the herring and cream. Who's next? How much, lady? The women elbowed past, their shopping bags crammed. The smell of warm, fresh bread floated out of a white bakery. The butcher's freezer door slammed shut with a great clunk. And here, with sawdust on the floor, was a store like Irving's Fish Market, with the live fish swinging in a tank, waiting for Irving's rolling pin to stun them just before the knife sliced off their heads. How much, lady? And along the curbs were the push carts of notions and buttons and thread, of a selection of ladies' panties, of factory second shoes, of sneakers tied by the laces, of bananas, just bananas, a push cart piled with bananas, a peddler, a specialist in bananas. With all those bananas, he had to move them cheaper than the next guy. How much, lady? They're rotten, a lady tells her friend. And everywhere were cries of life and commerce, and the smells of oranges and warm bread and fish and cheap new shoes. Cars inched through the narrow streets. Mothers and children shouted back and forth from the streets to the fire escapes. With Susan in tow, Daniel slowly drifted in the eddying currents of shoppers. Loaded shopping bags swung into him. Old men pushed him out of the way. It was a dangerous passage, but his heart was lifted because he had recognized Bathgate Avenue, and he knew it. Bathgate was spoken with approval by his father and mother, who regretted only that it was too far to go to shop every day. But the food was best there, and the prices cheapest, and on special occasions, like when Mindish was a character who Evidently stands for green glass because he testified against them. When Mindish, driving them in his old Chrysler, the Isaacsons would stalk up from the rich markets of Bathgate Avenue. Shopping on Bathgate was a skill. One took satisfaction from one's judgments and one's purchases. Daniel also knew that when he came to Claremont Avenue, he'd be able to see the hills of Claremont Park, and that by climbing up the steps from Webster Avenue to Claremont Park, he would inevitably come to Weeks Avenue, not 2 blocks from his home. "We'll be there soon, Susan." He knew she was hungry. He considered stealing something. He had already seen 2 different kids filching fruit, but he was afraid. He didn't mind getting shoved around in the street because he felt virtually invisible. Who could tell that he and Susan didn't belong to somebody walking right in front of them or right behind them? But if he stole something and was caught, he'd no longer be invisible. "We'll be home soon, Susan," he said over his shoulder. And then tell of that last leg of the journey, the most frightening and dangerous. Claremont Avenue was a wide, dangerous street of traffic, and when you had to cross Webster, a confusing, doubly wide street of tracks and buses and cars going 2 ways and lights that didn't seem to allow the opportunity to cross, it didn't seem like the street was meant to be crossed. Also, with the steep walls of the park on the other side, this was an area open under the sky. One's head and shoulders were vulnerable in the open spaces of the city. Crossing Webster and climbing the steep stone flights to the park, I became sensitive to the extreme danger of what I was doing. We were becoming exhausted. Also, now that we were leaving the depths of the East Bronx for the heights of Claremont, I remembered the Brookies, the gang of East Bronx terrorists who came up off Brook Avenue like the wind and raided the softer, barely better off neighborhoods around this park and beat up little kids and cut them and took their money. The closer we got to our neighborhood, the more frightened we became. Susan began to cry. The tears flowed. The snot flowed. We wanted to sit down on a bench and rest. She wanted to pull up her socks, which had disappeared again into her shoes. Her shoes were blistering the backs of her heels. The park was empty. A bitter wind was blowing through the bare trees, and piles of leaves whirled around our feet and stuck to our knees. Dirt stung our eyes. We turned our backs to the wind, and with our hands to our eyes, we whirled and turned and spun our way toward home. We looked from the porch through the windows. A silver light reflected through our faces, the silver sky racing over the schoolyard. The sky of silver raced through our eyes and through our house. The wind came up and pressed us to the windows. Gradually, the wind carried over the schoolyard from the soot hills of apartment houses in the west a last few crushed granules of daylight that fused the window pane to the room. The living room was empty. The walls were stained with crushed gray light. The floorboards were bare. The room was empty. The window lacked curtains. The house was empty. I moved to the other window on the porch. The room was bare, the walls bare, the floors bare. I tried the door was locked. I ran down the porch steps around the alley. I knocked on Williams's cellar door. I put my ear to the door. I hoisted myself up to look through the window of the cellar door. In the darkness, I saw the light of my own eyes. The door was locked. I ran around to the back of the house. I ran around to the front of the house. I looked through the porch window. There wasn't a sound from the house. The only sound was the wind. And Susan stood like an A in the middle of the porch, a darkening stain spreading under her foot. I was numb with cold. My face stung. My hands stung. I watched the stain expand in all directions around Susan's shoe on the wooden porch. According to Evans, observers in New Zealand report that mosquitoes there land on the floating pupae of females and slit them open with their genitals and mate with the females before they can emerge. Asher is the name that he gives to the defense attorney for the Rosenbergs, who became responsible also for caring for the kids, for making sure they were being cared for properly. The real Asher, of course, was Emanuel Bloch, who defended left-wing defendants, was famous for that. The year after the Rosenbergs were executed, he died of a heart attack at age 52. Asher held both of us under his arm, under a giant hand pressing us into his sides, into the bulky nap of his overcoat. We were walking down Tremont Avenue. My leather hunter's cap with the ear flaps was pushed awry by Asher's coat. He never knew his strength. Susan's face was red with the cold. We looked at each other across Asher's girth. Asher said, "If you children knew what you were doing to me, I cannot tell your mother and father, but how can I not tell them? What can I do? What can I do? I'm not going to live long." It was Sunday. The traffic on Tremont Avenue was light. Down at the Polo Grounds, the Giants were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. One of the kids in the shelter had gone to the game with his uncle, but Asher only had come to take us for a walk. The Giants had Charlie Connerly. The Steelers had Bobby Lane. In our hands were Asher's gifts, plastic orange jack-o'-lanterns, and a black cardboard skeletons. There were black cardboard skeletons and white bones fastened at the knees and the pelvis and at the shoulders with metal grommets. "What can I tell you?" Asher said. "Some people are singled out. The world lacks civilization. Men do not respect God. You're only children, and you can't understand. It's natural. I would run away too. Thank God I knew where to look. Ah, my children, what can I tell you? Soon we'll be in court, and we'll have our trial." So that's the passage that I wanted to share with you. It's interesting that in the trial, this was the Rosenberg case was a crisis in the Jewish community in America. Historians have always pointed to December 7th, 1941 as not only the Pearl Harbor Day, but as the peak of anti-Semitism in America with quotas for all the major schools of Jewish students and so on. And so it was a crisis in the Jewish community with the Rosenbergs on trial and on every front page in the country. It's interesting that the judge in the case was Irving Kaufman, Jewish. The defense attorney was Emanuel Bloch, Jewish. The prosecutor was Irving Sapel. He had just won the conviction of Alger Hiss just weeks before the Rosenbergs were arrested, Jewish. His assistant was Roy Cohn. I don't need to say anything about Roy Cohn. And so the government was bending over backwards to not make this look like an anti-Semitic event. But one of the reasons that the kids had to be sent for a while into an orphanage is that while the grandmothers took care of them for a little while, there was so much turning away from the Rosenbergs and anyone connected with them, to say nothing of the fact that the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses, the two grandmothers, were matriarchs of families who despised each other by this time. And so in this crisis within the Jewish community, there was extraordinary divisions, massive public rallies on behalf of the Rosenbergs, and other elements of the Jewish community wanting the thing to go away and go away quickly. So anyway, I think I would recommend E.L. Doctorow's anything, but this book is genius.